Removal of the Cherokees. Birthday story of Private John G. Burnett, Captain Abraham McClellan's company, 2nd Regiment, 2nd Brigade, Mounted Infantry, Cherokee Indian removal, 1838, 1839. Children, my children, this is my birthday, December the 11th, 1890. I'm 80 years old today, 80. I was born at King's Iron Works in Sullivan County, Tennessee, December the 11th, 1810. I grew into manhood fishing in Beaver Creek and roaming through the forest, hunting the deer, the wild boar, and the timber wolf, often spending weeks at a time in the solitary wilderness with no companions but my rifle, my hunting knife, and a small hatchet that I carried in my belt in all of my wilderness wanderings. On these long hunting trips, I met and became acquainted with many of the Cherokee Indians, hunting with them by day and sleeping around their campfires by night. I learned to speak their language, and they taught me the arts of trailing and building traps and snares. On one of my long hunts in the fall of 1829, I found a young Cherokee who had been shot by a roving band of hunters and who had eluded his pursuers and concealed himself under a shelving rock. Weak from loss of blood, the poor creature was unable to walk and almost famished for water. I carried him to a spring, bathed and bandaged the bullet wound, built a shelter out of bark peeled from a dead chestnut tree. I nursed him, protected him, fed him on chestnuts and roasted deer meat. When he was able to travel, I accompanied him to the home of his people and remained so long that I was given up for lost. Well, by this time I had become an expert rifleman and a fairly good archer and a good trapper, and spent most of my time in the forest in quest of game. The removal of the Cherokee Indians from their lifelong homes in the year of 1838 found me a young man in the prime of life and a private soldier in the American Army. Being acquainted with many of the Indians and able to fluently speak their language, I was sent as interpreter into the Smoky Mountain country in May 1838 and witnessed the execution of the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. I saw the hopeless, the helpless Cherokees arrested, dragged from their homes, and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades. And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. This is a true story, my children. One can never forget the sadness of that morning. Chief John Ross led in prayer, and when the bugle sounded and the wagons started rolling, many of the children rose to their feet and waved their little hands goodbye to their mountain homes, knowing that they were leaving them forever. Many of these helpless people did not have blankets, and many of them had been driven from home barefooted. On the morning of November the 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures, and from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey, on March the 26th, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokees were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire. And I've known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Among this number was a beautiful Christian wife of Chief John Ross. This noble-hearted woman died a martyr to childhood. She gave her only blanket for the protection of a sick child. She rode thinly clad through a blinding sleet and snowstorm and developed pneumonia and died in the still hours of a bleak winter night with her head gently resting on Lieutenant Gregg's saddle blanket. I made the long journey to the west with the Cherokees and did all that a private soldier could do to alleviate their sufferings. When on guard duty at night, I have many times walked my beat in my blouse in order that some sick child might have the warmth of my overcoat. I was on guard duty the night Mrs. Ross died. When relieved at midnight, I did not retire, but remained around the wagon out of sympathy for Chief Ross, and at daylight was detailed to Captain McClellan to assist in the burial like the other unfortunates who died on the way. Her uncoffined body was buried in a shallow grave by the roadside, far from her native mountain home, and the sorrowing cavalcade moved onward. Being a young man, I mingled freely with the young women and girls. I've spent many pleasant hours with them when I was supposed to be under my blanket, and they have many times sung their mountain songs for me, this being all that they could do to repay my kindness. And with all my association with Indian girls from October 1829 to March 26, 1839, I did not meet one who was a moral prostitute. They are kind and tender-hearted, and many of them are beautiful. The only trouble that I had with anybody on the entire journey to the West was a brutal teamster by the name of Ben McDonald, who was using his whip on an old feeble Cherokee man to hasten him into the wagon. The sight of that old and nearly blind creature quivering under the lashes of a bullwhip was too much for me. I attempted to stalk McDonald, and it ended in a personal encounter. He lashed me across the face, and the wire tip of his whip cut a bad gash in my cheek. The little hatchet that I carried in my hunting days was in my belt, and McDonald was carried unconscious from the scene. I was placed under guard, but Ensign Harry Bullock and Private Elkanah Millard had both witnessed the encounter. They gave Captain McClellan the facts, and I was never brought to trial. Years later, I met Second Lieutenant Riley and Ensign Bullock at Bristol at John Robertson's show, and Bullock jokingly reminded me that there was a case still pending against me before a court-martial and wanted to know how much longer I was going to have the trial put off. MacDonald finally recovered, and in the year 1851 was running a boat out of Memphis, Tennessee. The long, painful journey to the West ended March 26, 1839, with 4,000 silent graves reaching from the foothills of the Smoky Mountains to what is known as Indian Territory in the West. And covetousness on the part of the white race was the cause of all that the Cherokee had to suffer. Ever since Ferdinand de Soto made his journey through the Indian country in the year 1540, there had been a tradition of a rich gold mine somewhere in the Smoky Mountain country, and I think the tradition was true. At a festival at Echata on Christmas night, 1829, I danced and played with Indian girls who were wearing ornaments around their neck that looked like gold. In the year 1828, a little Indian boy living on Ward Creek had sold a gold nugget to a white trader, and that nugget sealed the doom of the Cherokees. In a short time, the country was overrun with armed brigands claiming to be government agents who paid no attention to the rights of the Indians, who were the legal possessors of the country. Crimes were committed that were a disgrace to civilization. Men were shot in cold blood. Lands were confiscated. Homes were burned, and the inhabitants driven out by these gold-hungry brigands. Chief Junaluska was personally acquainted with President Andrew Jackson. Junaluska had taken 500 of the flower of his Cherokee scouts and helped Jackson to win the Battle of the Horseshoe, leaving 33 of them dead on the field. In that battle, Junaluska had driven his tomahawk through the skull of a Creek warrior when the Creek had Jackson at his mercy. Chief John Ross sent Junaluska as an envoy to plead with President Jackson for protection for his people, but Jackson's manner was cold and indifferent toward the rugged son of the forest who had saved his life. He met Junaluska, heard his plea, but curtly said, "Sir, your audience is ended. There is nothing I can do for you." Well, the doom of the Cherokee was sealed. Washington, D.C. had decreed that they must be driven west and their lands given to the white man. And in May 1838, an army of 4,000 regulars and 3,000 volunteer soldiers under command of General Winfield Scott marched into the Indian country and wrote the blackest chapter on the pages of American history. Men working in the fields were arrested and driven to the stockades. Women were dragged from their homes by soldiers whose language they could not even understand. Children were often separated from their parents and driven into the stockades with the sky for a blanket and the earth for a pillow. And often the old and infirm were prodded with bayonets to hasten them to the stockades. In one home, death had come during the night. A little sad-faced child had died, and was lying on a bearskin couch, and some women were preparing a little body for burial. All were arrested and driven out, leaving the child in the cabin. And I don't know who buried the body. In another home was a frail mother, apparently a widow, and 3 small children, just one baby. When told that she must go, the mother gathered the children at her feet, prayed an humble prayer in her native tongue, patted the old family dog on the head, told the faithful creature goodbye. With a baby strapped on her back and leading a child with each hand, she started on her exile. But the task was too great for this frail mother. A stroke of heart failure relieved her sufferings. She sunk and died with her baby on her back and her other 2 children clinging to her hands. Chief Junaluska, who had saved President Jackson's life at the Battle of Horseshoe, witnessed that scene. The tears gushing down his cheeks and lifting his cap, he turned his face toward the heavens and said, "Oh, my God, if I had known at the Battle of the Horseshoe that what I know now, American history would have been written differently." At this time in 1890, we were too near the removal of the Cherokees for our young people to fully understand the enormity of the crime that was committed against a helpless race. Truth is, the facts are being concealed from the young people of today. School children of today do not know that we're living on lands that were taken from a helpless race at the bayonet point to satisfy the white man's greed for gold. Future generations will read and condemn the act, and I do hope posterity will remember that private soldiers like myself and like the 4 Cherokees who were forced by General Scott to shoot an Indian chief and his children had to execute the orders of their superiors. We had no choice in the matter. 25 years after the removal, it was my privilege to meet a large company of the Cherokees in uniform of the Confederate Army under command of Colonel Thomas. They were encamped at Zollicoffer, and I went to see them. Most of them were just boys at the time of the removal, but they instantly recognized me as a soldier that was good to us. Being able to talk to them in their native language, I had an enjoyable day with them. From them I learned that Chief John Ross was still ruler of the nation in 1863, and I wonder if Chief Ross is still living today in 1890. He was a noble-hearted fellow, and he suffered a lot for his race. At one time, he was arrested and thrown into a dirty jail in an effort to break his spirit, but he remained true to his people and led them in prayer when they started on their exile. And his Christian wife sacrificed her life for a little girl who had pneumonia. The Anglo-Saxon race would build a towering monument to perpetuate her noble act in giving her only blanket for comfort of a sick child. Incidentally, that child recovered, but Mrs. Ross is sleeping in an unmarked grave far from her native Smoky Mountain home. When Scott invaded the Indian country, some of the Cherokees fled to caves and dens in the mountains and were never captured, and there they are today. I have long intended going there and trying to find them, but I've put off going from year to year, and now I guess I'm a little too feeble to ride that far. The fleeting years have come and gone, and old age has overtaken me. I can truthfully say that neither my rifle nor my knife are stained with Cherokee blood. I can truthfully say that I did my best for them when they certainly did need a friend. 25 years after the removal, I still lived in their memory as a soldier who was good to us. I am proud of that. However, murder is murder, whether committed by the villain skulking in the dark or by uniformed men stepping on the strains of martial music. Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that marked the trail of the Cherokees to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory today, and it always will. Let the historian of a future day tell the sad story with its sighs, its tears, and be sure that he puts in the dying groans. Then let the great judge of all the earth weigh their actions and reward us according to our work. Children, thus ends my promised birthday story. This is December the 11th, 1890.